All right, turn to Colossians chapter 1. Colossians chapter 1. Verse number 9 says, "For this cause we also, since the day we heard it, do not cease to pray for you and to desire that you might be filled with the knowledge of his will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding, that you might walk worthy of the Lord unto all pleasing, being fruitful in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God, strengthened with all might, according to his glorious power, unto all patience and long-suffering with joyfulness." In looking at Christian ethics and looking at the practices and the behaviors that we deem appropriate or we think should be our lifestyle or should be considered appropriate for Christians, the next thing that we want to look at this morning, our next lesson, is going to deal, I didn't know exactly the best way to title this, but we're going to call it the Christian and business ethics. The ethics that govern how we personally interact, the ethics that govern how our personal dealings in this world should work. And if you would turn with me to the book of Genesis chapter 39, I think the best way to do this morning is to look at Joseph and this story here in Genesis chapter 39, because if you were to try and personify any of the things that I would want to say today, you would be able to see them in Joseph. And that would be whether you're talking about business dealings, personal dealings, practical ethics, moral ethics. He's a great example of that. And I just want to look today at our personal dealings, our personal interactions and dealings with this world, and the ethics that should be reflected by Christians, the character, the behaviors that should be deemed appropriate and expected from us. In Genesis chapter 39, we have the story of Joseph being bought by Potiphar. Of course, Joseph, sold by his brothers into slavery, is bought by Potiphar. And then chapter 39 tells us of his rise in Potiphar's house. It tells us of his interaction with Potiphar's wife and the circumstances that lead Joseph to being thrown in prison, and then the circumstances that lead to Joseph's rise even in the prison. And so we get a lot here just in this one chapter in Genesis chapter 39 about Joseph, the character that he displayed in all of these circumstances. Now, a Christian ought to be one of diligence. That would be the first point that we would look at. That our interactions, our dealings in this world should be marked by diligence, obviously hard work, dedication. In Genesis 39 and verse number 3, it says that his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him. And he made him overseer over his house, and all he had he put into his hand. Joseph's work was noticed. Now, obviously, Joseph did not get to elevation. He did not rise in Potiphar's house through laziness, through inactivity. He worked. He served him. Joseph did not give half an effort. He did not look at his life circumstances and the wrongs that had been done to him that led him to this place and allow that to deter him from the correct action, from the correct work ethic in that moment. Now, obviously, we know that the Bible teaches us to work. We don't have to read all of the verses that are in the Scripture about that. God created man with responsibilities. Paul tells us in the New Testament that if a man doesn't work, he shouldn't eat. It doesn't say that he can't eat, but if a man doesn't work, he shouldn't eat. The Bible tells us, Paul would also say that if someone doesn't work to provide for their own, he actually says that's worse than the infidel. That is terrible Christian character. There are lost people that do better. And so, one that won't work to take care or provide for his own, he says, is worse than accusations that could be made of the infidel. But though the Bible does tell us to work and teaches us to work, we should also be concerned with the quantity and quality of our work. Joseph is not the kind of guy that you have to watch, that you have to ride to make sure that he's doing his job. In this same chapter, Genesis 39 and verse number 11, Genesis 39 and verse 11, it says that it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within. Joseph didn't have to be watched. The boss wasn't there. Nobody else was there to see, but he was there to work. He was there to give his effort. He was there to do his job. We are told in the scripture, servants are told that they would serve as unto Christ. They are told to do service not with eye service. They're told to work not with eye service as men pleasers, but as unto Christ. In the book of Proverbs, we'll read several Proverbs this morning. In Proverbs chapter 6, I think everybody's probably familiar with the Proverbs where the writer gives instruction by telling the lazy one, by telling the slacker, the slothful, to go to the ant, to watch him, to look at him. In Proverbs chapter 6, we see that in verse 6. Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. But it notes this, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provideth her meat in the summer, and gathereth her food in the harvest. It's just interesting that it mentions that. You didn't have to put that in there, but the lesson would be the same. If you go to the ant and watch, the ant works diligently, it works hard, it works in the summertime, and it provides during the harvest so that when the time comes, there's ready and there's plenty there. But it makes special note that the ant works often without guide, without overseer, without ruler. And we should be diligent in that. We should be diligent and hardworking, not with eye service as men pleasers. Joseph gives us a great example of faithfulness and dedication and hard work, diligence, regardless of who was watching, regardless if anyone was watching. It's interesting. And when I went through in looking at this, and if you were to look up the word diligent or diligence, I was interested to see just in the book of Proverbs the way that word is used. Often when the word diligent or diligence is used, it's done to set up a comparison. Let me show you. Proverbs chapter 10, verse number 4. Proverbs 10, verse 4. Proverbs 10 verse 4 says, He becometh poor that dealeth with a slack hand, but the hand of the diligent maketh rich. Again, there you see it uses it in setting up the comparison between the diligent or the slack as it's there. Chapter 13, similar idea. Proverbs chapter 13 verse 4 says, The soul of the sluggard desireth and hath nothing, but the soul of the diligent shall be made fat. Again, the comparison there. Now, in looking at that word, and the word diligent or diligence, even when it's used and it doesn't do a comparison, it teaches the same thing. In Proverbs 22, we'll read one more of these. Proverbs 22 and verse 29. Proverbs chapter 22, verse 29, it says, Seest thou a man diligent in his business? He shall stand before kings. He shall not stand before mean men. Hard work, diligence, dedication. All of these verses begin to teach the same thing. Now, is hard work a fail-safe way to riches? Well, no. That is not a guarantee. Hard work is not a fail-safe way to riches. But laziness, the sluggard, the slacker, that is a fail-safe way to not get riches. That's how the balance in that works. You often find, that these comparisons, they go together. And obviously it's a proverb, and obviously you're not dealing with something that will guarantee you riches. But that's the principle. If you want something, that is going to be achieved, that is going to be gained by effort, by working for it, by putting forth the dedication, the hard work and diligence that is needed. If someone is paying us, if, I'm thinking about work, if we go to our jobs, if someone is paying us, we should give them an honest effort. I cringe, and maybe it's just an old-fashioned mindset, but I cringe when I hear people say, well, they only pay me $10 an hour, so they're only getting $10 worth of work out of me. Well, okay, fine, It's just not appropriate. It's appropriate to give an effort to someone who is considered, who is paying you, for someone who is your employer, and showing that dedication, that faithfulness, and that work ethic all the time. Tomorrow I'm going to go to work, and the nature of my job is such, or the nature of our team right now is such, that no one else will be at work tomorrow but me. Our team doesn't work from the office. Nobody's there on Mondays. And even my boss, my own personal boss, is out of the office on Mondays. Nobody will be there tomorrow. If I slack off and I don't do anything, there's not really any repercussions, because nobody will find out about it. He's not really there. If I don't, keep up on tasks, or if I don't keep up, on my deadlines tomorrow, he probably won't find out. Well, that tomorrow is going to show me what kind of a work ethic I really have. Am I working because he's there? Am I working because others are there? Or am I working because this is the right thing to do? Am I working because I have jobs, I have deadlines, I have things that are coming up, things that need to be done, and putting forth the effort to achieve those things and get those done? Joseph seems to be the kind, apparently, that whether or not he is being watched, whether or not there is someone there, he is giving an effort, and that effort is seen, that effort is evidenced, and causes him quick growth. You think it's odd that it's someone who was just purchased from the meat market, someone that was just purchased off of the slave trade, now is a high official in Potiphar's house? That doesn't just happen. That's not something that we just take for granted. This speaks well of Joseph and who he is. But not only going with that, with of course, hard work, diligence should certainly be part of our character. In Genesis 39 and verse number 6, we also learn that Joseph was honest, that he was trustworthy, and that would be something also that we say should always govern our dealings. It should always govern our personal interactions with people. An attitude and a character of trustworthiness, of honesty. Genesis 39 verse 6 says that he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. Potiphar so trusted Joseph, he didn't keep track of him. He didn't make him give an account. Now, if I was a wealthy man and I had someone in charge of my household or my finances, I think almost everyone would say that there needs to be some kind of accountability. There needs to be at least some kind of reckoning. Hey, at the end of the week, show me the spreadsheet, show me the numbers, show me what we took in versus what went out. Did we gain this week? Did we lose this week? If it's not weekly, maybe it's monthly, but it's like every facet of business has some form of accountability like that. You can't just go on indefinitely and not check. Well, if you have Joseph managing, apparently Potiphar felt that that's exactly what he could do. That he could trust it to Joseph, that he could put it in Joseph's hand and not care for it anymore, not consider it anymore, because he knew it would be well taken care of. He knew that Joseph had proven himself to be one honest, to be one trustworthy. In the book of 2 Kings, 2 Kings chapter 12, 2 Kings chapter 12, we won't have time to read the entire passage, but I'll summarize in saying that the temple had fallen into great need of repair. We'll simplify it by saying that. Breaches had been opened, things were falling apart in places. And so in 2 Kings chapter 12, you are going to deal with some of the work that is done to repair the temple. And in verse number 2 Kings 12, and let's start with verse 14. 2 Kings 12, verse 14, but they gave that to the workmen and repaired therewith the house of the Lord. Moreover, they reckoned not with the men into whose hand they delivered the money to be bestowed on workmen, for they dealt faithfully. I can't imagine in a project like this, in some kind of building project, in some kind of effort like this, somebody's not keeping track of what people are doing with the money. But yet these men seemingly have proven themselves that as they are given money, they are putting it to the right and useful cause. And so it tells us there in verse 15 that they reckon not. Like they didn't have to give an individual personal accountability of this. They were trusted. They were evidencing that they were doing right with it, and therefore had garnered the benefit of the doubt and were trusted in how they would handle that. Honesty should always be part of our business dealings. I'll give you an example of this. An interesting study sometimes should be what the Bible has to say about false weights. Now, there's a lot of that stuff in Proverbs, right? That a false weight, I think Proverbs 11 talks about a false weight being an abomination to the Lord. I want you to turn to the book of Leviticus in chapter 19. I was interested to find just how much, I'm not going to read a bunch of verses, we'll read a couple of places. I think of that concept often being associated with Proverbs, but look it up. There's a lot of places where this is talked about. There's a lot of places where this is mentioned. Give you an example, a couple of examples. Leviticus 19 and verse 35. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 35. Ye shall do no unrighteousness in judgment, in meat yard, in weight, or in measure. Just balances, just weights, a just ephah, and a just hin shall ye have. I'm your Lord, I'm the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt. These people haven't even entered the land of promise yet. They are still, this is before that. But as the law is given, God inserts here, and God makes it part of his requirements for this people that you're going to deal right with each other. You are going to justly deal. And so he gives them different units of measurement there, both in weight and in volume, that you are going to deal right with each other and deal honestly. One more in Deuteronomy chapter 25. Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verse 13. Deuteronomy 25, verse 13, it says, Thou shalt not have in thy bag divers weights, a great and a small. Now what does that mean? Well, obviously, if you had two weights in your bag, let's say that you had weights that were supposed to be a kilogram or a pound. If you're not a person who is honest, there is a temptation there to have two weights, one that's lighter, one that's heavier. And if you were the buyer, if you wanted to purchase, you'd grab out the heavier weight so that the other person had to contribute more than the actual pound, and that's what you collected. But if you were the seller, you might grab out the smaller weight. That way, what they put on the scale accumulated rather quickly. And you would, just depending on your scenario, whether you're the buyer, whether you're the seller, you would use a different kind of weight. And God says that's dishonest. Don't even carry them. Don't even carry two weights. Just deal rightly, deal honestly. God does not want the dealings of his people to be tarnished by the marks of dishonesty or accusations of improper things like this. You remember what we had said in previous lessons when Paul talked about the collection of money for the churches in 2 Corinthians. He was very conscious that people knew he was handling that kind of stuff rightly. Now there are a couple of warnings in Proverbs chapter 21. Proverbs chapter 21. Proverbs 21 verse 6 says, "The getting of treasures by a lying tongue is a vanity tossed to and fro of them that seek death." You are asking for trouble. It does not mean, the Bible doesn't tell us that you won't get treasures by dishonest. You can acquire treasures by dishonest means. You are absolutely asking for trouble. Similar thought in Proverbs 10. In Proverbs chapter 10, in verse 2, it says, "Treasures of wickedness profit nothing, but righteousness delivereth from death." Treasures of wickedness, or treasures that are acquired inappropriately, won't do you as much good as you think. That's just something that is common to men. That is just something that proverbially we could say is true generally across the board, that when people acquire things by dishonest, it doesn't do them as much good. It doesn't last as long. The Bible tells us in another place that they're more frivolous in how they spend it. You didn't work to earn it, so you really don't care how it gets spent. And then there's also not the satisfaction of actual achievement. When you've actually worked for something, when you've earned something. We've talked before, and I don't mean to embarrass her, but when she was young, then Cece saving up her money and doing jobs and earning money so that she could buy her American Girl doll. And just the sense of achievement and satisfaction that went with that, that was really cool to see. And it's the same way, not just for kids, it's the same way across the board. It's a general principle of life. That when dishonesty and underhanded dealings are part of your character, you're asking for trouble. You are not asking, you're not putting yourself on the path to success. You might gain from it. You might get the money. You might get treasures from it. But you have not set yourself up for happiness, for joy, or success. So be trustworthy. Joseph was trustworthy. His boss, Potiphar, could leave things in his hands and it's good. It's taken care of because Joseph was trustworthy. Let me try to get one more in here. Genesis 39, once again to our text here for Joseph. And I'm only hitting highlights. You could obviously, we've done studies about Joseph. You could look at his life and you could point out so many things. But I thirdly want to say this about Joseph. God's people should be marked by consistency. And Joseph was. I'm going to look at this two ways. Okay. First of all, I would say that what we just talked about with Joseph, this was his regular character. That's the first way. When I mean consistency, this was his regular character. This was not a one-off. Let me explain this. Genesis 39, we just read how Potiphar put things in his hands and basically took his hands off because Joseph can be trusted with it. Now that was not a one-off. Look in verse 22. Joseph is now in prison. He's been falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, and he has been thrown in prison. But in Genesis 39, verse 22, it says that the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. People have discovered time and time again that if you leave it in Joseph's hands, it works out. Joseph takes good care of it. Joseph will do right by it. This is not something that was a one-off for Joseph just in Potiphar's house. Joseph worked, you would not say that Joseph worked hard for Potiphar because he was lucky. Of all the people that could have bought Joseph from the slave trade, he got to be bought by a master. He got to be bought by a highly elevated official in Pharaoh's kingdom. And that's why he worked hard for him, because, he considered himself lucky and wanted to, keep that job. He's in prison now. And you know what? His character hasn't changed. Prison didn't change him. Joseph did not look at this situation and say, well, I see where honesty got me, and then change. Some people might look at it like that. I was honest. I tried to do the right thing. I tried to do the right thing all the time, and look where it got me. Joseph just continues. He just kept doing it, and the keeper of the prison found the same thing. Doing right all the time. In Proverbs chapter 16, notice what it says here in verse 8. Proverbs 16 and verse 8. Better is a little with righteousness than great revenues without right. Better is a little with righteousness than great revenues without right. Doing right regardless of personal benefit. Now, we've mentioned in one of our previous lessons that a Christian in his behavior is thoughtful of what his actions potentially produce. But we made mention that there is no guarantee. A Christian cannot control the outcome of his actions. It's absolutely possible for you to do right and it not work out in a worldly sense. You could do right and trouble come because of it. You could do right and someone reject you because of it. Apparently, according to this verse, the person who's righteous is ending up with a little, and the person without right has great revenues. And yet the Bible tells us that one avenue is still better. If a previous righteousness doesn't turn out to worldly benefit, this verse would remind us that it's still better to do the right. Okay? If you have the choice between right and wrong, and the righteousness doesn't turn out to worldly gain, it's still better to do right than to secure worldly gain by a different way. Still do what's right. You can't always control outcomes. You can't control those things. In Proverbs 3, verse 27, this is a simple verse that I think to me speaks to something much greater. Proverbs 3, verse 27. Proverbs 3:27 says, "Withhold not good from them whom it is due, when it is in the power of thine hand to do it." There are a lot of things that we don't get to control. But those things that are within our control, we are expected to do right with them. Okay? If it is in your power to do so, do right. There are things in this world you can't control. You won't be able to control. But this one, what's in thy hand to do, do it. And Joseph was consistent. He did so for Potiphar. He did so when he was in the prison. And again, like I said, it's not a one-off. Read later in the book of Genesis. Read later as he interprets the dream of Pharaoh and he is again elevated in Pharaoh's kingdom. He tells him about the dream, right, of the 7 cows and the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. And Joseph is elevated. Pharaoh elevates him and he puts him in charge of all the plans and all the preparations. And when the 7 years, I'm just going to read one verse, when the 7 years of plenty are over and the famine begins, the Bible tells us that people come to Pharaoh for bread. And here's what it says, Genesis 41, verse 55. When all the land of Egypt was famished and the people cried to Pharaoh for bread, Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go unto Joseph, what he saith to you, do. Pharaoh has just been challenged with his dream, and Pharaoh has been challenged with his kingdom. Like, you're talking about your kingdom. You know, the fate of your kingdom rests in the interpretation of this dream, and he puts the entire work in the hands of someone else because that person had deemed himself consistent and faithful and trustworthy. And I'm going to say this lastly, looking at our text again, Genesis 39. When I say consistent, the first way I wanted to look at that was his regular character. This was not a one-off for him. But I do want to say lastly and quickly, by consistency, I also want to say that what Joseph was in private matched what he was in public. And we are told that in the story of what happens with Potiphar's wife. You and I know how he works. You and I know his public persona, his public character, that he is trustworthy, that he works hard, that he's diligent, that he's respected, that all can be seen. But what is Joseph behind closed doors? What is Joseph when he's by himself? What is Joseph when no one else can see what's going on? He's the same. And so we're told here in Genesis 39, when Potiphar's wife had said to come lie with me, it says in verse 8, he refused and said to his master's wife, Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? There's a very, now I'm going to say this knowing, of course, God sees all. You never hide anything from God. There's a very real possibility that Joseph could have done what Potiphar's wife asked and no one ever found out about it. But he didn't. And that's what it means to be Christians are not two people. Christians are not one way in public and one way in private. We're not supposed to be. Now there are two different kinds. There are some that say that, the private, the public life is most important, right? That we show forth, evidence good character, that we're honest, that we're trustworthy, that we have a good reputation. But what is behind closed doors is private and doesn't matter and shouldn't be an influence. People shouldn't think about us privately. That's our private life. I don't think that's right. In like fashion, I would say that the other group is wrong because there are some that say, well, a Christian is what I am personally, and it's what I do on Sundays, and what I do Monday through Friday shouldn't be the test of whether I'm a Christian. Yes, maybe some of the dealings that I have or maybe some of the things that I do out there in the world don't match necessarily what I am on Sundays, but how can you say I'm not a Christian? I go to church, I'm doing those things. I don't think that that's helpful either. To say that the private life is all that matters or to say that the public life is all that matters, I think a Christian's not two people. I think a Christian ought to strive for consistency, that what we are is someone who's attempting to do right when it is seen and when it is not seen. And if God was the only one that saw it, that was enough for Joseph. And he said, I can't do this. First of all, my master has trusted me with all this. He's not even going to ask. Joseph knows he can do this, and his master's not even going to ask, what did you do today? You know, there are some people that try to keep from doing wrong because they can't keep a straight face, right? There are some people that are bad liars. And if you ask them something, you'll be able to tell it on their face. Joseph knows Potiphar's not even going to ask. He could have done whatever, but he didn't. And that speaks so much of his character that whether he was seen in his dealings with men, it mattered to him. But in a private, intimate, one-on-one situation where maybe no one else in the world would have known, he still wanted his dealings to be right. He still wanted his character and his honor and his reputation to count and to amount to something. We are concerned with our dealings with other people. We want a certain ethic and a certain behavior to guard us and influence us in how we act toward others and influence our dealings with them. The last thing we want to be considered is dishonest or two-faced, like we're two different people. So let's try to be consistent. Joseph is just a perfect model for all those things. Father, we're grateful to come today. We are thankful for the